Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Hi, everyone. I've spoken on previous podcasts about resilience and bouncing back from challenges and dealing with adversity. But this week's episode takes that to a whole new level. My guest is John Peters. John is an RAF veteran. He spent 20 years in the RAF flying Tornadoes for a good chunk of that time. And then once he'd left, he continues to have a very successful career in business, owning and running the consultancy and coaching firm Monke business, which he's built from scratch. And largely that's on the back of his experiences in the RAF, because some of you will remember the Gulf War in 1991, when John was shot down and captured by Saddam Hussein's forces over Iraq on his very first operational mission, and was held captive as a prisoner of war for 7 weeks, during which time he was brutally tortured and interrogated on a daily basis. That was something of an epiphany for him, and he talks about that in terms of what he took from it, in terms of it actually strengthening him rather than breaking him. And it's a remarkable story. I would say, and I don't often have to do it, as a proper trigger warning on this does talk graphically about his experiences as a prisoner of war. And the language is, as you might expect, pretty fruity as a result of that. So it's both fairly explicit, but also very graphic. So please be very conscious of that. And if it's not your thing, this is possibly not an episode for you. On the other hand, if it is something you're prepared to listen to, I think you will find it incredibly illuminating, not least because John has some amazing insights on leadership and huge experience that he's been bringing to bear over what's now a 25-year career outside the RAF. So he spent longer outside than he did in, and he's put that to amazingly good use. It was a great discussion, and I really hope you enjoy it too. Here we go. John, thank you very, very much indeed for joining me on the podcast. Absolute delight to have you here. Really looking forward to what I think will be a fascinating conversation.
No, and thank you for having me. I've seen your podcast or listened to the podcast, and it's a privilege to be in the list of people you've had thus far. So I hope I don't disappoint.
You certainly won't do that, I'm sure. I mean, you've had a really successful career, starting out in the RAF, but then subsequently a range of private sector roles. You've now got your own business. I mean, you've been out of the Air Force longer than you were in it. And I'd be really interested in some of the leadership experience, particularly that you've got, and the leadership development work you do. And we'll talk a lot more about that. But just to get us started, could you give listeners who don't perhaps know you so much, then just a summary of your career so far?
Yeah, certainly. I'll do the form bit, shall I? If you take the old school, I am Squadron Leader John Peters. I was an RAF Tornado pilot. Obviously a bad one. Definition of bad pilot is I have more takeoffs than landings, because I was involved in you're a fellow pilot. I was involved in the first Gulf War, and on my first mission in the Gulf, I was shot down and captured and held as a prisoner of war for 7 weeks under Saddam Hussein. And I was paraded on television, and that notoriety, when I returned to mass media attention. I stayed in the Air Force until 2000, but had this parallel lifestyle of speaking, because that experience rather catapulted me to an entirely different lifestyle, I suppose. But through various things from both my Air Force experience, I had done an MBA, and I was talking to the corporates, so I decided to start a business, a coaching performance business, because my last job in the Air Force was looking at human performance. So I put that all together to start a business. And for the last 25 years, I have been looking at leadership, strategy, innovation, and being a coach, looking at strategy. I'm a professor of a couple of universities, and now, just as you get old, I'm on a number of boards.
Fantastic. And we'll definitely come back and talk about an awful lot of that stuff. And particularly, obviously, as I think we were said just before we went on air to do this, you can't get away with not talking about the POW time. So I think there's some to talk about there anyway, in terms of resilience and personal resilience and what you learned from that. But motivations is one of the things I always talk about with my guests. What was it that really got you into the Air Force in the first place?
It's a funny question, that, because I really don't know. And why I say that, I will go on to specifics, but I've never not wanted to be an Air Force pilot. Where did that come from? I don't have military in my family. My parents did national service, but I don't really have military. I didn't have any flying in my family, but I always wanted from whenever I could remember. And there's something about, and forgive this word, in today's world, there's something about the elitism, the individualism, the few. I suppose really it all emerged from probably things that we get told when I was going through school about the few, the whole country protected and defended in such a significant way by all these young men against unbelievable odds. I bought into that. I very much bought into Douglas Bader. Now, like with any experience, there's a dark side of Bader that has subsequently come out, but I still maintain all leaders have a dark side. And what he was and his abilities were just unbelievable. And I wanted to see whether I could live up to them. And that whole sense, I know you're going to ask me about Gulf because I won't be able to avoid it. But do you know, when I was sitting in the Gulf as a prisoner of war, thinking I was going to die, I thought, can I live up to the few?
Okay. Yeah, fascinating. I can completely see why that would be a really focusing thing, and actually probably quite a helpful thing in some ways in terms of giving you an aspiration, giving you something to focus on. I mean, let's dive into the Gulf War thing, because it is a good segue into the subsequent longer discussion probably on leadership, which is what this podcast is all about anyway. But your life clearly changed in all sorts of ways, both during and subsequent to it. You've already said that in terms of the mass media attention piece and so on. I mean, I was on exchange when the Gulf War happened. I was flying with the German Air Force.
How frustrating.
Yeah, it was very frustrating, no question about it. I was watching all my mates go off to do the thing we'd all trained to do, and I was sat there with an Air Force that wanted nothing to do with it, and that was difficult, no question. And one of the things that I've often thought about over the years. But I mean, I remember watching it on TV, and obviously the early days in particular, the Air Force took some serious punishment and lost a lot of airplanes, and you were clearly one of those where obviously you got shot down, got captured. The pictures of you and John Nichol, who was your navigator at the time, still shock, I think, to this day when you actually look at the images that went round. And I remember the kind of feeling of anger that was out there in this country, and the way the press hammed that up as well. And obviously, to be honest, a lot of expectation that, well, we're probably never going to see you guys again. And it wasn't just you, it was a whole bunch of people who were in a similar situation to you. I'm really interested just in that chapter of your life, really, what the run up to the Gulf was like for you as an Air Force pilot, and particularly as obviously I was sitting there watching with envy all the people going and doing it, but also then the mission, the period of time in captivity. I mean, obviously we'll get perhaps to it afterwards, but the impact on you afterwards, because I think there's lots of stuff that comes from that. I mean, clearly that shaped pretty much everything you've done since then, I guess, in a significant way. So your thoughts?
I was, as you say, I was a pretty junior. You were quite senior Air Force pilot, and many of my friends that, were more senior, but it's all about how your career and, so much when we talk about leadership, so much is about timing and being in the right place at the right time, dare I say. And that may sound obscene with my experience, but when you say timing in life, I was doing a normal everyday job. I was flying in northern Germany when Sunny over Guard. This was in August the 8th. Over Guard, the international distress frequency, you got kite formation, return to base, which was back then when we had the nuclear deterrent, and the Tornado Force was the nuclear deterrent. That was the recall for nuclear Armageddon. And you thought, shit. But you didn't think shit because you say, we've had no intelligence that so what the hell's happening? But we flew back, jets on the ground. And long story short, Kuwait's been invaded. Our first question was, where the bloody hell is Kuwait? Now everyone knows it is kind of being center of the universe, but you end up going, where the bloody hell is Kuwait? We then did the build up, and that was very interesting. I went from 15, 18 hours a month flying Tornadoes to literally 60, 65 hours a month. Suddenly, all the normal organization restrictions are removed to the extent that you are suddenly saying we need to fly with big tanks, which normally require testing. It was basically test them out on the squadron. If they work, use them. So you're getting this, the real fluidity of when the shit really does hit the fan. It's like companies, don't waste a good crisis. Suddenly there was a whole bunch of exploration. And then we went out to Kuwait. At the time, there was never going to be a day low level sortie. When the war started, we were meant to be midnight to midday. We went into midnight to be the planning for the following evening. And we were told you're going in at 6 o'clock in the morning. And this idea that you just do what you're told, yes sir, no sir, is rubbish. We literally argued for 3 hours going, this is a suicide mission. The risk has been determined that there will never be a day low level sortie by a Tornado against an airfield, which are the most heavily defended targets. But we lost the argument and we took off at 6 o'clock. I got shot down at 9:30. We were the only day low level sortie. I disagree with the decision. I know who made the decision as well. It's when the environment is fluid, the people who made the decision, I respect. They were not bad people, but I do think it was the wrong decision. But that is life when the world gets fluid. So at 9:30, we were attacking Aramala Southwest, which was a dispersed operating base, which is basically a spare airfield, which was meant to be undefended. It was really heavily defended. And the whole way in, we were shot at by guns, by missiles, anti-aircraft guns. You've got missiles going past your cockpit. You've got the yellow ribbons of the bullets going past you as you're going in. And we're going to a loft attack. A loft attack is where you slingshot the bomb a number of miles so you don't enter a zone around the airfield. It keeps you out of the defenses. And you slingshot the bomb a number of miles. I pulled off. The bombs didn't come off. There's various reasons for that are technical, so I won't go into. Recovered off there. One of my prides is actually recovering a loft maneuver with 8 tons of bombs on, back down to 50 feet when you're getting shot at the whole way in. Coming off the target, on our way home, we're doing about 515 knots, 600 knots at 50 feet above the ground, and a SAM-16 in our blind spot, totally in our 6 o'clock, went up our right-hand engine, exploded, took out the fire-by-wire system, and the right-hand engine as well. The aircraft rotated a couple of times. Don't know how I missed the ground. Put the wings forward because it's a swing wing bomber, and recovered it. Then anti-aircraft guns hit my right-hand wing, hit my Sidewinder missile, ignited the rocket propellant. Sidewinder is about 4 feet away from me on the right-hand wing. A 4-meter torch of flame shot out the front of the wing and slowly but surely started to cut the right-hand wing off. I flew for we flew about 3-4 minutes, but basically my whole world became orange. I couldn't see any of my aircraft. So we ejected at 320 feet because the black box, that was the height we ejected. I was in the parachute for seconds on the ground for about 2 hours. Eventually about 25 soldiers found us, buried us in the sand by machine gun fire, beat us up a bit, took us off to Baghdad. Arrived in Baghdad, things started getting nasty. So all the stuff you see on television with the bombs going off, the anti-aircraft guns, we entered into Baghdad. They were smashing our face against the side of the lorry, hitting around the head with pistol butts. Everyone's firing Kalashnikovs around us. The bomb, the anti-aircraft guns. Pushed out the van through a corridor of troops. Within 2 seconds of being in the ops building, a bomb hit the building. We're blown up and end up under a pile of, I was thrown 4 meters, picked up 2-3 meters, thrown 4 meters, ended up under a pile of desks, rubble and chairs. The next thing I know, in a little room, it's about 15 feet by 10 feet. You're handcuffed, blindfolded, bag in your head. You can sense the heat of the light against you, spotlights against you. Smell and sense. There's about 8, 9, 10 men in their room. You can smell their sweat. You can smell smoke. you can smell violence and you can smell death in the room. And that's the interrogation starts. So for 4 to 5 days, no sleep for 4 to 5 days, you're beaten with baseball bats, with rubber truncheons. They set your hair on fire. They burn you with cigarettes. I had 2 crushed vertebrae from my ejection. I've got a broken back, basically. They smashed that with baseball bats. They threatened you with gang rape. They threatened to cut my dick off. They threatened to shove guns and knives up my arse. You hear people being tortured. I've been blown up 6 times. I lost 2.5 stone in 7 weeks. You're kept in solitary confinement. I lost count of the number of times I had mock executions. And that just continues. And after 7 weeks, there's a knock on the door. The door opens. Normally it just flew out. No, they came and beat the crap out of you. And this guy stood there in a suit saying, "Good morning, Flight Lieutenant Peters. I'd just like to tell you the war is over. Is there anything my staff can do for you?" And so released. And long story short, you go from complete and utter isolation in a box where they're systematically beating you and starving you to death to literally hundreds of journalists. And my description, you go from a complete black box to complete white light. You can't see anything because there are so many flash bulbs going off, so many lights on you. They are literally pushing the American ambassador, who was one of the guys who met there, this venerable, distinguished gentleman. His head was just getting pushed out the way. There are literally hundreds of cameras, and I'm talking inches from your face. And that's when you realize your life is being catapulted to an entirely different level.
Blimey. Yeah, that's a hell of a story. I mean, sympathy doesn't go there at all, does it, in terms of how that must have felt for you? I before we get to the leadership bits, how did you manage that personally in terms of your time in captivity, going from day to day? What was it that kept you alive ultimately? I mean, your personal focus, because I can easily see, and you will have done this. I mean, I know very well that after the Gulf, that Gulf War, we changed all our process around resistance to interrogation training, and we provided a lot better training, which is obviously still training, and it's nowhere near what you experienced. But at least it provided some better context, I think, which we were not prepared for at all at the time that you will have gone through that. So how did you actually cope? What did you think about day to day in terms of life?
Well, you start saying, I'm quite surprised because in reality, I'm not a particularly militaristic person, actually. I joined the military to fly. I didn't really join the military to be in the military. And I'm relatively lackadaisical, really. And to be a pilot, you need to be very disciplined, I suppose, and quite sequential in thinking. And I'm not a sequential thinker. So that's why learning to fly was so hard for me. Once I learned to fly, I was okay, but learning to fly was really hard. However, maybe I am, because in captivity, I was really disciplined. I used to basically wake up each morning and do exercise. I always made a list in the morning of things I was going to think about, because if you look at the walls and the beatings, and the immediacy, you become myopic, because that consumes your life. So you have to look beyond the walls and beyond the beatings. And the way you do that is put a mindset beyond the restrictions of your circumstance. So I very much made a list every morning and it had to increase in size, of what I was going to think about that day and in my life and what I would do beyond that. So, excuse me, because I am going to swear, because that's how I normally, 7 weeks, fuck 7 weeks. I'd set my mind for 10 years or death. And in that time, I knew I was going to die painfully and with humiliation, but you almost lock yourself into your sense that yes, they can, and again, apologies for the language, they can fuck you, they can cut your balls off, they can pull your teeth out. I had, on the way in, and why am I swearing, is because on the way in, I'd seen all these Midnight Express films. They took 10 hours to drive us in. And I set my mind then. And all the films have ever shown prisoners of war, they come up back damaged, and they damage the people they love. And I, for 10 hours, going in with a bag on my head, knowing full well what was going to happen, I went, I will not come out a damaged human being. I'm either going to die here or disappear in the Middle East for 10 years. And the mantra I had in my head was, you can cut my balls off, you can break my legs, you can pull my teeth out. I will not come out a damaged human being. And if I get released in 10 years' time, Helen will be married to someone else, and my 2 children will call another man daddy. I will not damage their lives. I will meet them and I will separate, because life has taken them on a different route. And that was my idea of love, that I would separate because I could not have the life I had.
Well, I mean, such an emotional thing for you, and I can see that as we have the conversation. I think it's impossible for anyone who's not been in that situation to really imagine what it must be like, and you can prepare yourself as you obviously did, and it clearly worked. And you have, subsequent to that, had an amazing life on the back of it. Having got through it, because when you were there, you mentioned you were in solitary a lot of the time.
Whole time.
Did you have any contact with any other prisoners at that stage, or was it all?
For 2 days, I was put in with an American prisoner of war. But by that stage, I mean, I can't help saying bad things. He had the most appalling shits. I mean, he was pissing out his bum all the time. Now, it was freezing cold. He said, well, let's sleep together because bodily warmth keeps you. But he was covered in shit. You know,
It wasn't an attractive proposition.
No, and then there was silly things like we were given a piece of pita bread, half a cup of soup each day. That was the food for the day. So that's why I lost 2.5 stone in 7 weeks. They're not being fed. He didn't eat the bread because he didn't like it. And all our clothes, we had Hessian suits that were ripped, and it was pitch black almost. But when you did have the 4 hours or so, it's semi-pitch. You take the phrase off the bottom of my trousers, a cloth, and try and, because it's only Hessian, with your fingers, you take 2 hours to do half an inch of just trying to stitch your clothes together. He was in rags and he was shitting himself. And I just found myself, look, if they're going to kill you, look at them in the eye and die like an officer.
Mm.
I was irritated with him, to be honest. But that's my selfish. You've got to realize that's my selfishness, because you end up, how you survive, or how I survived, was you don't define yourself by the circumstances. So I very much locked myself in myself, because you have to, because they are trying to psychologically dismantle it. It's a mental fight. But please, here's the real big thing. I'm assuming you've heard of PTSD.
Yeah.
Everyone's heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, everyone talks about that because it's a great story. Nothing better than someone as successful as you that suddenly life falls apart. You go, that's a great media story. It's really boring if you go, God, you did really well in your life, Bob. Yeah, that was great. But and you had a really shit experience, but you coped. Well, how boring is that? But obviously, as well, and you've been in the military, you've heard of post-traumatic growth, haven't you?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, you're one of the few people, because when I also know most people, 80-90% of people go, no. Well, it's the Nietzsche, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of adversity makes us human beings weak. First of all, the statistics are 75% of people cope. About 20+% of people suffer post-traumatic stress, which is an extended coping mechanism. So you take longer, rather than just coping and getting on with it. And it's perfectly natural and normal that you are sleepy, you can't sleep, you're tearful, you're emotional, and it's an extended coping mechanism. Only, and I think the stats now, about 5% of military people suffer PTSD. I was initially told 2 or 3, but that's years ago. And we've had Afghanistan and all the others since. So let's say 5% suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. So when people say, could I deal with this? Yes, you could. 95% of human beings cope. For those who can't, absolutely give them every help. I believe in therapy and all this sort of thing. Absolutely. But 95% of human beings cope. But on the other side, you've got post-traumatic growth. That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So if you don't like this interview or something I don't like, what is the worst you're going to do to me? Are you going to torture me? Are you going to kill me? I spent 7 weeks of that. And my most learned experience was where I couldn't control. After I thought I was going to get gang raped, they stripped me naked, 7 guys filmed me all over, and they were going to shove knives up and guns up my ass. I was back in my cell. They didn't eventually. So I wasn't raped, but I was shaking uncontrollably, and I was really angry at myself. I couldn't control my body shaking, and that angered me. But after it calmed down about half an hour later, I suddenly realized that I'd learned a level of fear. And they had to be, it doesn't matter what you do, whether you drill a kneecap or do something like that, that it's not the violence per se. It's I'd learned a level of fear that they've got to be really creative, that they can make me touch that level of fear again. And once you learn how to deal with fear, because I suddenly realized I can learn faster than you can be creative in making me frightened. And I knew from that moment on, they were never going to win. And my whole leadership thing subsequently is, how fast do you learn? We all live in an uncontrollable world, but it's the speed at which you learn, the depth at which you think about stuff, and how much you share that information. Because whether you got a PhD and the sharpest man or woman on the planet, human beings learn at an unbelievably slow rate. To become a fighter pilot, years of training, to sustain that skill, years. That's why robots are so, because they connect robot, you get instant learning. It takes us years to learn skills. So both individually and as organizations, it's the speed at which we can learn, the depth at which we think, and the breadth at which we share. And from my experience as a coach for the last 25 years, certainly in organizations, lots talk about it, but they just don't affect that. Now, I'd include the Air Force in that. Mm-hmm. It's a training organization rather than a learning organization. And we're now faced with technologies that are learning faster than the human can adapt and change to. And how we harness the levels of technology we have as leaders and as organizations. And we're now in a world that's so connected, we have global issues that humankind has to deal with. How we learn fast enough to adapt and change, given how slowly we learn, is challenging. And then you've got the superficiality of social media, where the most ignorant have the biggest voice. And it requires real depth of thinking to try and address some of these issues we have. And the push for profit in most organizations diminishes the depth of thinking because of the immediacy of the return we require. And so that was the gift the Gulf gave me. Do you know how much confidence it gives you? So do not go away thinking I'm a damaged human being. I suddenly found I could learn fast. I learned about myself in a way that is an absolute gift. And I actually found myself. As you'll know, there are some stunning characters in the Air Force who, God, they must have had inertial nav systems stuck up their bum when they flew. They could just intuitively know larger. And I found those characters in the Air Force. And I always thought everyone was better than me. But I had a couple of instances in the Gulf where senior rank officers said, you led us through the Gulf. And that is why I started my business, because I have started and spent the rest of my life trying to explore, because I was said they would not have got through. We trusted and believed in you that we could get through. And I said, I'm in a concrete box with a metal door being systematically beaten and starved to death. I could do nothing. And that has made me explore, and this is my leadership aspect, is it's how as human beings and organizations and teams, how do we deal with uncertainty? And it's not what you do when you're uncertain, it's who are you when you don't know the answer? Who are you when the world is changing around you? Who are you when you're uncertain? And who are you in a crisis? Are you the person who steps up, steps in, or steps away?
Yeah, do you fold or do you get stronger? I totally get that. And I can completely see that, if you push right to the edge, as you clearly would have been in that situation, and by any measure that's horrific. I mean, just your description of it is absolutely appalling. I can see how that would be with the right character, which clearly you have. It would firmly put you in a place where it does make you stronger, does enable you to do lots of stuff beyond it, assuming you physically survive it, which you clearly did, and then move forward. Just before we move off the topic, though, I mean, you touched on that transition out of the concrete box and the daily beatings and the starvation and all the rest of it into the kind of global attention and the cameras in your face and light bulbs going off, etc. How did you manage that transition for you personally? But the other thing was, how was it for your family? Because I've talked on other podcasts actually with people about, particularly in a military context, often every time I was on ops, I always felt it was tougher on my family than it was on me, because we're doing the stuff we love and we're doing, we enjoy it and we're busy. And when I was in Afghanistan, that was a classic example for that. I had an extremely busy job and, it was very demanding. But I think for my wife, it was an awful lot tougher because, she's sitting there watching the news and the news is always bad and there's always stuff going on that is negative. For you, clearly, it was a whole different thing. I mean, Helen and your children will have seen the stuff floating around here in terms of the images of you and so on. It must have been absolutely appalling for them. So how did you kind of manage that transition out of the whole situation to relative normality?
That's quite a stacked question because there are multiple levels in that question. So I go black box to white light, which I've just covered. So complete isolation to complete attention. First of all, I think, and it is said with a wry smile, but you go, there's a certain requirement to be a fighter pilot, and that's shallow and arrogant. I don't, we love ourselves. God, do we love ourselves?
We love talking about it, flying and ourselves
yes,
as well.
How do you tell a Harrow pilot? You don't have to, he'll tell you.
Very true.
That's the point. Pilot is a consuming career. And when you return to the level of attention and fame is like a drug. It's really quite life affirming. It's really frightening, but you deal with it in the same way you deal in captivity. In captivity, you're hanging on to your identity when everybody in the world has an opinion of you, and I'm not overstating that fact there. You're in every newspaper and everybody's been to war and everyone's done amazing things, but you're the only one who has attention. Everyone has an opinion on you. It's the same as captivity. You hold on to yourself. But you can't do that. What happened, though, is on return, I'm a 29-year-old flight lieutenant, which is pretty junior rank, and you suddenly have a 55-year-old air marshal crying on your shoulder. You have the station warrant officer who's 50, who is telling you about the divorce of his children, and whether he wants to stay with his wife. I lost my rank, basically. Within months, you're being asked by a rape crisis center to talk to women who've been raped. You are everywhere you go, people are crying. I returned to 25,000 letters. They were coming in at 1,500 a week.
Jeez.
They were majority and I've replied to every single letter I've ever received. Majority are from children who've been abused or people who've been abused as children. So you have to dial down that fast jet militarism. And it is a conditioning where we have to dial up when you join that focus, that not arrogance, that measured, directed confidence that you need to do the job we did. You need to, and the militariness of what you're doing, which is the application of violence for political ends. You have to dial that bit down and dial up the other aspects of your character of empathy, compassion, and understanding. So you're then playing this parallel life between being a military pilot. Well, it's three worlds. The shallow part of fame, because you're in all newspapers and you get invited to nice posh hotels that you couldn't afford and everyone wants to see you. And I could list out famous people I've met. And that's nice, but it's all under the glare of publicity. But the more engaging and enlivening bit is how people treat you and share their most intimate details. So you have to almost balance those two things out. And that's the same for Helen. So Helen, my wife, is a strong, spunky character. Look, if you want to employ anybody, and ended up as a chief executive of a travel business, you would employ Helen. Helen's done 100 emails by the time I've done a Sudoku and had a cup of coffee in the morning. She is really quite amazing. And so you go, oh, bugger. Okay. And so we had known each other since, 18, 19, and been together since. And I knew when I got shot down that Helen, and I didn't have to worry about Helen because Helen's a strong character. And we talked about that. And as you'll know, we'd already, by 18 months back in the day, within 18 months of leaving flying training, we had already been to 12 funerals of our friends. You've lived in the same era I did.
Yeah, it was a tough time.
The first funeral was a guy called Andy Mannheim, who was a jack pilot. We went to his wedding. 3 months later, we went to his funeral, and we didn't receive the wedding photograph till after his funeral. That's the world in which we lived. 3 months after that, Paul Nelson, died. I could list out my friends who died. So whilst we don't experience the visceral nature of war that the army does, and we didn't do Northern Ireland, things like that, the helicopter pilots did, I'm saying the world in which we lived, we're actually, in terms of preparation for being emotionally not, when you're a pilot, when you see really good friends die because of the job we chose and their partners. Helen was really well prepared. Helen always used to say, I never sent you to work with an argument because your office went 500 miles an hour and you may not come home. So that's how we led our lives. We had that conversation before we went to war. Helen, and everyone says, gosh, you must have been really shocked seeing John on TV. And she said, well, no, because at least I knew he was alive because he'd been shot down and it was evidence that I was alive. Now, she said, I didn't know whether he's alive after that. But at the same time, life is always paradoxical in terms of it's all very well your husband being paraded on TV. And yes, of course, she was upset with that. But she had a 2-year-old boy and a couple of months old baby. So she's breastfeeding and potty training at the same time. So her life is consumed with that. And she doesn't take that in a negative way. She said, well, because I had so much on my plate just dealing with that on my own. So we're quite a stoic couple, to be honest.
Yeah, having that focus must have been very valuable, I suspect, in terms of young children to look after and so on. And I think the strong character thing makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, I've seen on ops, particularly in leadership roles on ops, things have got much better, not least in terms of accident rates, as you described them, and much less fatal accidents now, fortunately. But also communications and things on operations have got a lot better. So people can actually speak more readily. They can email all the time, that sort of thing as well, which was not always the case. I mean, I can remember vividly being out in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf in 1998 when we were doing the southern no-fly zone. And I was running the detachment there. And we had, our 10 or 15 minutes, whatever it was, phone call a week. That was what you were allowed home as your welfare call. And the amount of people, that was really, really challenging because you could guarantee that all the bad stuff that was going on back at home, in whatever form that was, and some of it was totally trivial by any measure, that would come out in the last 2 minutes of the call. And the amount of times I was dealing with quite challenged individuals who were going, oh my God, this has just happened and I've now got another call, not another call for another week kind of thing. And you'd weigh up whether or not it was a genuine issue that you could therefore provide some more flexibility for them. But that it does make a huge difference if you've got a strong family behind you. And I think that's true in any walk of life, frankly. I often talk about with the leadership training I do that you've got a work life and a personal life. Everyone has got those. And what you can't afford to do is have both of them out of balance. You can afford for one of them to be out of balance at once for periods of time and let the other one help you to pull it back in. But you can't afford for them both to be out of balance for any significant period of time. And I really believe that's true.
That's where I agree with you totally. This idea of, first of all, in the old days, this is before social media and the internet. If people went to war, you had that separation. So, and there's a strength and a weakness in that separation. But there's also a strength and weakness, as you are referring to, in the connections, because You're trying to get people focused in an extreme environment, as in a wartime environment, which when you stand back from it, you go, how ridiculous. You're going to put your body on the line. You probably could die, get blown up or shot. No one in their right mind would do that, but the military steps into that environment. And in some ways, it's easier if you separate that from you being a quiet, caring person at home as father or mother in a family context. So, and trying to balance off that now with that connection. So there's, again, it's paradoxical. And I think that's how I do think that in terms of leadership, how it's evolved, it used to be when we started, and the Air Force has grown up on this. And also, I think generally organizations have grown up. They, in the more, let's say in the 70s, it was quite the corporate way when some of these old execs I've talked to in Ford, there was the Ford way of doing this, or the IBM way of doing this, or the military way of doing leadership. And it was almost the one style. And this is how we do it here. Whereas now, I do think we have grown up a bit, and you can't deal with everybody in the same way. Everybody, you don't know what people are dealing with. And it's actually, I think it's, as a leader, the paradoxical nature I find is you have to be consistent with your values and what you stand for and what you stand in and how you present yourself. There needs to be a consistency, because that becomes the North Star, over and above all the normal stuff on North Star. You as a human being become a person that has integrity, says what you do and do what you say. So that, but you can't use the same leadership style, even though you'll have a preferred style. You can't use that on everyone. You have to be inconsistent. You have to apply a different approach to different people. Some people are really stoic, just get on with life, and that's fine. Others, one may find it pathetic when you go, look, you've broken a nail, and you just don't understand why they've gone to such. But if that's important to them, you lead them in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And that's what I found myself, I suppose, learning in captivity and being, in true style, I had been immersed within a military way of leadership, but you're dealing with people who've all been immersed in it, and therefore you're all coloured by that. Whereas the separation from the military in some ways, both in the Gulf, but then subsequently, because it was so dichotomous, that you suddenly realise, look, you can't deal in stereotypes. And actually what it opened me up, particularly as a pilot, because we're the least exposed to leading other unlike types, because we just went, I bet if you cut us in half, we did the same track as pilots. Whereas that's what introduced me. Suddenly, the airmen and airwomen are talking to me in an entirely different way. I'd lost my rank. I mean, in a good way. They weren't talking to you like an officer. They were sharing problems. You go, and I'm suddenly going, what am I meant? How? Why do you suddenly believe I have any ability to help you? But that photograph that was of the TV pictures, whatever that did, whether I believe it or not, whatever that presented me, the world, I had not changed. You ask Helen, what did the Gulf do to me? It made me more confident. It gives you a real confidence, the opposite to what people think.
Yeah, well, that says a lot about your character as well, though. I mean, I don't think that would be necessarily true for everybody.
I disagree totally. And that's why I go back to the statistics. This idea that there are extraordinary people, I think humankind is extraordinary. We are far stronger than we believe we are. And I'm nervous about this. And I do believe supporting. I get the anxiety with social media, and I get this, we've got to be intelligent and not be the last generation going, I hate the word snowflake. The greatest generation, we go, what would today's generation be? They wouldn't send you or I to war. They'd send the 18-year-old now, who we would say snowflake and feckless. They would win the war just as the past generation.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
And if you look at the 1950s, when we put these labels, and I'm really nervous about labels. The greatest generation. If you look at the 50s, it was a turgid decade because so many they didn't talk about it. So many damaged human beings coming back from war. And I think that's, if you looked at the cultural evolution of the West, certainly, where you get into the 60s, basically when you became teenage and dad saying, look, when I was your age, I had already buried 20 of my mates and you don't understand. And I think the 60s evolved into, dad, life can be fun. It can be joyous. It can be, and I refuse to live this reductionist view, and we're going to have an expansionist view. So I think you could look at culture of militarism has its place. It is a required thing because human beings haven't learned how to have a conversation. But that deterministic, reductionist attitude of mind does not, it works in war, but then it needs to be released to work in a different, you can't use that in the NHS because it's a fundamentally different problem with fundamentally different issues. So you can't apply the same leadership style in every single business I've been, whether it's charity, whether it's in Singapore, I work in Nigeria, Africa, Asia. And that's why I find it really alarming. There are so many Western, male, Americanized leadership books. Whereas how many leadership books have you read from African leaders or Indian leaders or Russian leaders? And you could say, oh, but that's really, we got Putin. You go, no, you have to understand that a fundamentally different mindset. And so I think that's what the Gulf provided me, because I was just catapulted from military to this quasi having to understand a very empathetic and passionate difference. The idea that, are we a leader because you choose to lead? Or I didn't choose the life I had. It was literally put upon me. So because people chose to follow, whatever that image, whether I understand it or not, I have been positioned in my life in a fundamentally different way, whether I choose to or not. And it's taking the responsibility to recognize that and adapt to new circumstances.
Some great points in there. I think the generational thing, I think, is really interesting because I talk about this quite a lot myself, where you get this view that, the Generation Z, they're a real pain, they're lazy, they're difficult to work with and all the rest of it. And I tend to say to people, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what everyone would have said about us.
Yeah.
And generations before that and before that.
Ptolemy in AD 300 or what have you said, things like that.
Yeah. And so I totally agree. And I think the other interesting thing is in terms of different types and different styles. I mean, a friend of mine who helped me sort of co-found Leading for Life as an organization, she's a social psychologist, and she talks very openly about 4-quadrant psychometrics, and she doesn't like them. She says that the trouble is, what it does is it boxes you in, or enables you to feel you're boxed into, this is my type, this is my personality type, and therefore this is the way I behave because I am that type of person. Whereas the reality is that obviously nobody is one particular type. Everyone's got different traits of all of the different sort of types. And I think the one thing I've learned from that kind of psychometric work is what it does is it enables you to understand better how other people tick, and therefore how to make them work more effectively, and to comment to them, help them, support them, work with them to get them to a space where you're communicating in a way that works. Because otherwise, if you're talking past them, and if you're not careful, because they're just they're not on the same wavelength as you. And I think there's so much of that is really relevant, whether it's in different types of businesses or even within an individual business with different people, because they are all different, and finding out what ticks for the different people, what really upsets them, motivates them, helps them, supports them, is key to taking that forward.
I understand why we have psychometry, and I'm qualified in a whole load of them. And now you go, how do we take the randomness of human behavior and try and understand it in a better sense? So it is science, and psychology has gifted us a whole load. But this idea of, yes, well, I'm a red or a blue or a green, and that means I don't do detail. Well, that's really good. You mean you just dump it on other people? We all have to do that. But I think we're far more survivalistic. It's how do we enable others to effectively, it's like the Simon Sinek, believe what we believe. Why do we follow Apple? We believe what Apple believes. And how do we do that in a sense that enlivens them? So many of the things I do in leadership are things like, and we never get this, this idea of soul, joy, hope. You will have heard the Stockdale paradox.
No, I don't think I have, actually.
Oh, I love the Stockdale paradox. My word, I came out from my captivity was flip-flop, but that's because I'm not a Congressional Medal of Honor winner and didn't end up as an admiral. You see, that's why I left. No, Admiral Stockdale was the longest service high-ranking Vietnam prisoner of war. And you need to look at this, and every leader needs to look at this. Absolutely. And I'll balance why. They said, how do you deal with I think they broke every bone in his body in his time, 7 years in captivity.
Jeez.
So this was not 7 weeks. This was serious shit. And he kept on being asked, how do you deal with something? And he said, well, it's paradoxical. He says, yes, you have to deal with the brutal reality. So you have to deal with the torture but if you only remain in that arena, you'd give in, because life is not worth living. It's pain, it's humiliation, it's degrading, it's just, and he said, if you stayed there, you'd give in and die. So you can't stay in that, just the brutal reality of the circumstance. So you need enduring hope. But you can't live in enduring hope because you're not dealing with the brutal reality. So if I said, right, Bob, you're in this. If I asked you, and this is a rhetorical question, you're safe on this. If I asked you to record and play to me the conversations you have with your loved ones after you've made love with your pillow, you don't want anybody to hear that, because that's when we're at our gentlest, our softest, and our most vulnerable. And if I said, well, I thought about my view of hope was very much keep it at arm's length, because if I put myself in the hope of seeing Guy and Tony and Helen again, that's when I'm soft and it's love and it's lovely. But you go, it makes you weak. You cannot afford to be weak and soft in the brutal reality. So my idea is hope is something that is beyond arm's length. It's just beyond you, but it drives you towards. But you can't live in enduring hope because it makes you weak and brutal. So the paradox of his thing is the paradox in nature. How do you balance brutal reality and enduring hope? So for my mind, you flip-flop between the two. So this is why I have a criticism of psychometrics, because people label themselves and say, well, I'm just one thing. None of us are one thing. So you flip from the brutalistic beatings and then enduring hope. But you also flip, and how I dealt with it is sometimes your psychology, your worst enemy in captivity is yourself. So they walk past the door, your brain suddenly goes, oh, they're going to gang rape me, oh, they're going to cut me, and you are your own worst enemy. So that's when you've got to control your rationality with who you are. No, I'm here, this is me. So you control your emotion and your fear through your brain saying, it's not happened yet, don't be ridiculous. At other times when you're really overwhelmed with emotion, you flip-flop between your emotional self and your rational self, because each at a moment provides you a strength. So you turn into yourself when they're telling you you're the only one, you're the weakest, and they're playing all the psychological games, etc., to you, because they're trying to make you subjective to them. And you have to pull into yourself, and that's where the identity, and that's why I go from black box to white light. It's a sense of who you are, what you stand for, in an emotional sense. Other times you have to control yourself through the rational of you're emotionally running away with yourself, but you need to say, well, it hasn't happened yet. That's not occurred. So it's this, I think it's all paradoxical.
Really interesting. I mean, I think we're violently agreeing actually on the psychometrics thing, particularly because interestingly, I mean, if I do some of the various tests, I'll come out as a not very detail orientated person at all.
No, nor am I.
And quite kind of directive. But the reality is when I do a lot of the work I do, I'm very detail orientated, because you have to be, because you've got to prep well, you've got to be, on your game to deliver what you're expected to deliver. Over time, you learn and you become more flexible, and you are adaptable in your style. One of the things these days people are much more sensitive about is language. And it's one of the things you see a lot, I think, in an awful lot of settings where you people say things that they don't mean in a particular way, and they're interpreted in a different way by whoever's listening to them. And maybe different audiences or different ears in the same audience will hear things differently and interpret it completely differently as well. And you have to, I think, in a leadership space now, have to be quite conscious of that and be focused on it.
Yeah, if you go back to the Second World War, the businesses, Rolls-Royce, Avro, Morris Cars, or all those old were British firms owned by Brits. Rolls-Royce is not owned by British people now. It is owned across the globe. Every company is a global company. And therefore, the style of, almost hierarchical style, first of all, is no longer relevant, but some of that language is no longer relevant because it was very much of an era. And I understand why people are uncomfortable with this changing language of the modern era, but you go, it's because the world has fundamentally changed. Fundamentally changed. It's like talking when I find it interesting when people go, oh, we can't, we're working in Leicester and we can't find a computer expert. You go, why are you advertising in Leicestershire? And you're asking for an IT person. You can go to India, you can go to Nigeria, and they can do it online. And they can do it for a tenth of the price. So the old ways of doing business, the world has globalized, whether we like it or not, and whether you get countries that possibly become more isolationist, the world, you cannot close it's a Pandora's box. You cannot close that box on globalization, however much you want to try, because the economics of it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the language, the fear I do have though, and this is the real nemesis, I think, for leaders, as you say, human beings, none of us communicate very well. All of us don't communicate in the right way because here we're two old white blokes talking here. But if you're talking to someone who was brought up, let's say, as Nigerian, Muslim, female, in the African economic system, etc., when I'm trying to translate, as we're trying to have a discussion here, trying to translate, and we'll generally agree because we're immersed in the socialization of everything we went through, but trying to trace my internal conversation, put that into this conversation, which is speaking. It's got to go through all the filters of she is Nigerian, Muslim, all those filters before it enters her internal conversation. Well, that requires different conversations. And the trouble is, because none of us are very good as leaders or as human beings, the danger is we say the wrong thing. And I am uncomfortable, this idea of being labeled because we've thought it's the intent behind the word, not the word itself necessarily. And so we have to explore what that means to that individual.
I agree. And I think that cultural understanding is an increasingly important facet of anyone that's working in any organization, really, because they are going to be dealing with a much more multicultural society, even in an individual country, never mind when you're actually working across the globe, as most organizations do. So if you're not investing some time and effort in upping your ability level in that space, then that's a missed opportunity for sure. And it's not going to help you as an individual leader.
So the skills nowadays, certainly with the business now, I principally deal with, blue chip and big companies, etc. But the real skills I think that people do is one, that cultural ability. And culture doesn't just mean just across different nationalities or religions, etc. It also means, how nowadays I think it is recognized, an IT company has a very different culture to a marketing company. And within the company, there are tribal effects. So you've got that cultural intelligence, and that requires this inconsistency. And I mean that in a positive sense. You have to deal with each of those in a different sense. But the other one, and I know you could say the latest trend and these things are fads, but they're not. It's the increasingly growing of geopolitical awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it used not to matter what happened, let's say, for sake of argument, in Bangladesh 60 years ago, because the speed at which things traveled until it affected a business in the UK was slow. Well, now the share price is not determined by the British, determined by the global markets, and a new idea, the classic disruptive innovation, a new idea in Singapore, in South Africa, instantly, overnight, from some young person, have been introduced a fundamentally different thing, can access the globe and actually affect the share prices and everything, if I talk within business, in UK literally tomorrow. So I think those two things, geopolitical intelligence and cultural intelligence, are fundamental in leadership today.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, when I was working for Deloitte after I left the Air Force, we lost a piece of work at one point on cultural fit.
Yeah,
with a client, and when you sort of examine it in the cold light the day after the fact, you can see why. I mean, it was a crisis management thing to some extent. It wasn't all our fault. We had no notice really that we had to go and appear in front of these guys to talk to them in the midst of a crisis. but we just looked all wrong for them. We turned up in suits and they were not a suits organization. We were all, it was just the team we had at the time was all men. They happened to be all white. That was unlucky. That was just, it could have easily been different on the day, but it wasn't. And it was enough that turned them off. And there were some other factors in there as well. But that was a key discriminator in terms of whether we were going to win that piece of work or not. So again, paying attention to that, I think for sure is really critical.
The other thing I find now, and it is my little bit of a bugbear, so forgive me, is I know now we go, and I do totally agree, leadership is about listening, etc. But virtually every chief exec got there because they have some strength of character, to be honest, because you need that drive. And I know everyone says strategic calm and, and I totally appreciate, albeit I'm not an introvert, but you go, the power of introverts, absolutely agree half the time, funny enough, because it's 50-50, stop talking and the introvert will answer the question that all the experts have been just talking about, and they absolutely have the answer. I totally get that. But this, for senior leaders, and I've seen it just too many times, where you go, you got strategic calm, this idea that you listen, you float above, and this is part and part political intelligence, that, the more senior you get, you need to be politically intelligent and maybe speak less, let people tell you that. And I get the word strategic calm. But there is a tension between, and I'm quite often, and forgive me on it, give me some strategic boldness. And actually, I just see no courage, because people are, whether it's they get their equity shares or their promotion or their rank or respectfully their knighthood, you go, where's the boldness to actually answer the damn question? Again, it's paradoxical. Yes, you've got to play it, because the more senior you get, the more players you have to deal with, which means it is far more complex. Anybody can lead a team respectfully, 50, 100, 100. When we're across net, there is a political thing, and I understand. But then I hate this word, and I argue with Air Force people all the time. Evolution, not revolution. Well, that is such old thinking. And I would like to have not just some sense of boldness in the companies I work with, and courage, and that's across levels, middle management. Oh, we can't do that. Yes, you can. You're being given a gift by the senior people. Come up with something. Well, here's the idea. Great. Will you introduce it? Oh, I'm not prepared to, challenge my career. No, you're being asked, and they won't step forward. And it's not my job to push them forward. And so many leaders just lack of boldness nowadays. And forgive me, I get angry as I get old. You know the answer. Why aren't you doing it?
I do agree with you. I think part of that, and I'd be interested in your view, is because we've created this institutional nervousness in people about offending somebody.
Yeah.
And it is because everyone's walking on eggshells, because are we using the right language? Are we using the right terminology? Are we coming across as too directive versus being too democratic? All those kind of things play together, where I think it just makes some people go, do you know what? I really don't want to put my head above the parapet here, which is a bad thing. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think we need people to be bolder and take tough decisions, and be absolutely prepared to take very tough decisions when the time is right and required to do that. And that's why you're in a leadership role, ultimately.
Yes. And my step up, step in, or step away is, do you step up when you don't know the answer, even though no one knows the answer, and actually have the courage to at least go, well, vaguely, we don't know what we're doing, but let's all have a conversation. Let's go that way, if nothing else. And the moment you make that decision, at least providence moves. I'm not saying it's the answer. It's saying, let's just vaguely move, doing something. Or are you a person who steps in? And what I mean by steps in is, look, I'm not the big character, Bob. You are. You've got that. You've grasped it. But I'll step into your team. Maybe I'm not the right character to lead at the moment, but I'll be in that team to absolutely step in, support. And I know we don't know the, and most things are created through a group leadership team rather than an individual. The individual is more the representative or the ambassador for that. I did a speech with Nelson Mandela. I thought I'd drop that in, by the way.
That's a good name drop.
I shared stage, and he said, yeah, I thought that's name dropping, isn't it? And he basically said, everyone's turned to me. He said, it wasn't me. Everyone in South Africa was going that way. They just put me in front of the group. So the whole mindset was going that way. But it was not just him. It was the talents behind him as well who pushed that shift forward. And then you get people who step away, who won't step into the uncertainty, even though you've taken the leadership role, if I use that as a thing. And actually, they step away as in, I'm not prepared to risk anything. They step away from the uncertainty. And that is my fear. And I'd agree with that idea of language. And the trouble with that, if I got vague, not political, party political, but you go, the challenge with that is, I do believe in this, if you took the normal curve, so normal again is a dangerous word, isn't it, nowadays? So I'm using as the normal curve. You've got the greater entity in the middle. But if we're not prepared to step in, and I agree with changing our language and being careful with language, but there is still a boldness with sometimes we must be very careful to label, and that is what the extreme political idealists are using by destroying really good people because they've labeled a word they've used. And it's so easy now with social media to use it in the wrong context. And suddenly we're removing people who are prepared to step up and lead. And that, I think, it means the ignorant have the loudest voices. And that is extremely dangerous. And that's going back to why speed at which we learn. And when you say the depth of conversation, it's how much time are we actually spending to deep dive a thing? Because you'll have done strategic programs. Oh, we want 2 days in a very nice hotel with a senior team. And you go, 2 days is not enough. I know you're immersed in this. It's not enough to fundamentally question who you are, because you get groupthink. You get all those things that every consultant will use, unconscious bias, How do we shift you to think fundamentally different outside our individual bubble of experience? And companies are not prepared to spend that level of money or indeed time to have that depth of thinking. And it is, and every company says, if we want an innovative company, that requires differences. So across gender, skill set, different degrees, just complete differences. And it requires people to work together and share new ideas. And so many of the businesses will talk about innovation. They hold innovation programs, but they don't enact it in their real business.
Yeah, I think the other end of that is interesting as well, because the other area I think corporately that's very poor is debriefing.
Yeah,
following through at the end of something. I just don't think most organizations that I've seen or worked with, both in Deloitte with the clients that I work with at Deloitte, but also beyond that, they jump from one thing to the next thing. They're busy, they finish a project, they jump straight to the next project. They actually don't take the time to go back through what did we actually learn, how can we be better next time, and all that stuff we would have done intuitively, particularly from an Air Force point of view flying. I mean, one of the points I make to people is every single sortie I ever flew was debriefed. Even if it was flying a single-seat airplane, flying a single mission, I would still sit down and think about, right, what went well, what could have gone better, what can I take away from that and apply differently. That is another area I think that is a real growth potential and force multiplier, if you like, in terms of people actually being able to be better if they took more time to genuinely harvest what they've done and apply that to what they're doing next in terms of improving their thinking.
I agree in part. First of all, it's relatively easy when you've got a small group. So, but I have, right, I'll start this with, I agree. However, okay. So, because I was immersed in that whole, the after action review, if you take the American view, or the debrief culture, I get all that. And that's a lot of consultants like me for 20, 30, 40 years have been saying that, there's things in the military that the military do particularly well. That proof of concept, the army, we don't do proof of concept. I think that's really good. You've got the trappers thing in the Air Force, where you get the performance group who go around to check that people do perform, and they're there. It used to be cool trappers because they weren't supportive, whereas now that's morphed into how do we get organizational learning across. And that's the thing when you get into organizational learning. And I know you'll go, Google will say, oh, Google does it, and all these IT companies, actually, they're some of the worst. When I've worked with IT companies, they're meant to be all very hip and very, we learn from each other. But again, it's a lack of confidence to actually share mistakes because of the pressures of the business. And we can do it as a team, but how do you get that organizational learning across the organization at pace to become a truly adaptive and flexible organization. I use the OODA loop. For those who haven't been flying, it's from a guy called John Boyd, and it's how you win in air combat, which is you observe, you orientate, you decide and act. And it's the speed at which you go around that and the iterative nature that John Boyd, who designed agility for air combat. Now, within that environment, I mean, a lot of people over the years, because it was in the 50s he brought these ideas in, a lot of strategists go, oh, well, you can't apply it to a big company. I disagree, because what I find interesting is when I run strategic sessions, everyone goes through the PEST, the SWOT, whether you go the Ansov's matrix or whatever way you want to do the strategy, both at an annual sense or individually do tactical moves. But the thing a lot of businesses don't do, they don't orientate their business towards what we would call the threat axis. So they don't nudge towards what that information is telling them. They do the strategic, they do the big, oh, well, this is, strategy is what tactics is what you see, and strategy is what you don't see. But they fundamentally don't nudge their organization or their team to address that immediate threat. And that's the classic disruptive technology, is something that you think is meaningless. Before you know it, has taken over your business. So the decide and act, I get it, all the things we're talking about, cultural, geopolitical, and the increasing difficulty of scale at leadership. That does slow down some of the decisions and the actions. And it's trying, how do you in an organization learn to speed up that process? So that's how I'd apply the OODA loop. It's a lot of people do analysis. Some businesses call strategy, and I'm saying that from my experience, some businesses do strategy. Everyone talks about a lot of people, even basic strategy, they don't do.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But that, I think, is a management conversation. When did you last have a conversation of how do we make it simple? Right, we've done the analysis. We've done our strategy. Okay, and we spent 3 days of really smart people, 10, 12 of us, leadership team. When did we spend a day? And I'm saying a day without doing the finance. You go, right, we're going to sit down. We've just spent 3 days trying to decide what we're going to do. And we're really smart. We've been in the business for 25 years. And we're globalized thinkers. We're cultural thinkers. And it's taken us 3 days, if not more, to come to this conclusion. So that means there's a lot of advanced level thinking. What you now need is advanced simplicity. Now, when did you last do a strategy day when you go, oh, we've got the action plan, go, rather than sat down going, okay, we've got the answer. How do we make it simple for people?
That's a great point.
How many times when you're in Deloitte did you go, let's do a session on simplicity? How do we make what we've just done simple for people to buy into, simple for them to understand the reasons why we're changing them, asking them to take less pay, asking them to work longer hours, or asking them to totally reevaluate their businesses? From my experience of being a consultant 25 years, never.
Yeah, I was going to say never. It's not a common thing at all.
But the second, so one, how do you make it simple? And the next step is these making it simple. And this next thing are the leadership conversations. So analyze and strategize are management conversations. You've got to cross the line, the conversation into how do we make it simple? And then you say, how do we make them easy to do this? Because we are creatures of habit. However we can think organizational, how do you say everything, you've done really well in your career, you're a middle senior management, and you've been really successful on the formula you've applied, but now we want you to change your formula. Pardon? And if you don't change your formula, you're out this game. How do you make it easy for people to change? Skill is based on unconscious habits down to individuals. So how do you make it easy for them to apply that?
I think how do you make it attractive for them as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you need to turn around and basically, what's in it for me? If you're not doing that and you're in getting them to buy into the concept, you've got a much more challenging path ahead of you. I mean, not saying you're on a hiding to nothing, but it is much harder if you're not actually making it attractive for the individual to turn around and say, yeah, okay, I can completely see this and I buy it and I'm inspired by it and I therefore want to follow it.
But going back to your original point of the fighter pilot mindset and the learning and all this stuff, that's easy in a team. How do you do it at organizational level over time? And to have real learning over time, because everyone say, well, the context changed. Yes, I know, but there's the power of learned experience. How do we make sure we don't make the same mistake twice? How do we not get into, induction programs are great, but it almost goes, we don't think the way you do. You've got to think this way when you join this organization. And therefore it removes new thinking. And that's why I have Monkey Business. My business is Monkey Business, because it's going the classic story. Monkeys in a cage, pole with bananas at the top of a pole. Monkeys instinctively go to climb the pole to get the bananas. You spray that monkey with a high pressure ice cold water. Eventually not a single monkey climbs the pole. Then you take a monkey out, put a new monkey in, the monkey goes, oh, pole, banana pole, goes to climb the pole. All the other monkeys, they pull them down because they relate it to pain. Slowly but surely you replace every single monkey until not a single monkey has ever been sprayed with ice cold water. Yet not a single monkey climbs the pole. So it's learned behaviors. So closed systems, and I will say respectfully, like the military system, because you don't have people coming from outside into positions of accountability. I know they give it an expansive view by trying to broaden, but not by accountability. You therefore it's very difficult to get new ways of thinking into a closed system.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think even though in organizations where they have got that opportunity, to your point, often they don't do it, because what they'll do is they'll tell them, this is the way we do it here. And they don't encourage or incentivize in any way kind of newer thinking within the organization. And that's a real challenge, if you're not prepared to do that. And I think part of it is genuinely having people who have either got lived experience that helps with what you're trying to do. We used to find a lot when I was doing the crisis management work with Deloitte, actually, that leaders who had been through a crisis themselves of whatever form generally got it. They saw the value of investing time and effort in having the right kind of plans in place and preparation and doing some training and, and not seeing it as some other leaders did who hadn't been through that as just an institutional overhead. We're not going to face this. It's not going to happen to us. So therefore we don't need to waste time and effort doing it. And of course, then they end up in something bad, and it's much, much worse because they haven't got any kind of start point and preparation in place. So no, I totally and utterly get that.
So this whole thing, and I know it's a word being, the learning organization, a truly learning organization is really hard to, we can start learning organizations, and that's why, new companies do so, and it's great. But over time, to create at scale one of these real global businesses, to continue to be a learning organization is hugely difficult. And this all goes back to this idea of how you adapt to things. And I'm not saying this is the right answer, but I am trying to apply it as well in my family life, because I looked at my father moved into a lifestyle that was very similar to his father, and his father joined. And so youth tended to, when we were brought up, we joined the world that our fathers would recognize. Whereas our children now, because of globalization, because of our children, and I think the reaction to that is countries started closing ourselves off because it is so scary. We're moving into their world. So rather than us moving into our parents' world, as I am now a parent and now a grandparent, it's our responsibility at our age to adapt to their answers, not the other way around. And I think that's a shift in society that's happened because of the evolution of the computer. I went to a conference 15 years ago where a doctor said, possible, we have stem cells, we have the full DNA profile. The only thing we don't have is we don't have enough computer power on the planet to distinguish the proteins. But if we have a quantum computer, and it evolves, at the time it's theoretical, which has the same computing power as every single computer on the planet at the moment, he said, we've already had Dolly the sheep, we could literally, the human condition, possibly within 50, guaranteed within 100 years, the human condition will be immortal. That was 15 years ago. I would anticipate now, with all the people who are the real thought leaders on AI, even the people who started it, going, we've got to be careful here, because this idea, robotics do no harm. First law of robots. Well, if robots are, again, learning faster because they can, because human beings learn slow, how do we adjust as human beings to a world where the robots learn faster, yes, we could become immortal within the lifetime of my children, possibly not, but certainly our grandchildren. What do we do as a generation to start setting up and adapting our systems to set in train for that sort of future, rather than trying to hang on to what we've built for ourselves in our generation? Those are the biggest leadership issues. You need bigger brains than me. I'm just not big enough brain for that. But those are some real fundamental things that humankind has to address at this moment.
Interesting, isn't it? I think it's a very fascinating set of challenges that are out there for the world in terms of climate change, in terms of artificial intelligence, and solving some of these enormous problems, geopolitical tensions that are there, blah, blah, blah. You know, there's a myriad of things we could talk about that I think for today's leaders, tomorrow leaders and the next generation as well, you know, for sure, it's not going to be boring.
But how do we develop that boldness?
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. Over and above the normal evolution of generational leadership, because each generation does something different, and 20 years, etc., for each generation. But in organizations now, how do we? And you could say, well, those are so big, none of us can solve it, and a global. But you go, but the leaders required at this moment in organizations to ensure that organizations adapt and survive. These theories have been around for decades, and yet in my time, and I don't know about you, it'd be fascinating with your experience of, are you seeing real change in organizations, or are you just seeing nudges?
I think nudges at the moment. I think the interesting thing would be, in my head, and I don't have an answer to this, but I do wonder whether this is one of those sort of pendulum swing things where, you know, we're seeing the pendulum kind of a relatively high deflection at the moment, maybe even almost full deflection in terms of the behavior within organizations, that nervousness, institutional nervousness we've been talking about and so on. And potentially the pendulum starts swinging back. You know, it's not going to go back quickly necessarily, but it will go back more into the middle and then out in the other direction potentially, where you get more boldness back. And I think there's no doubt. I mean, interestingly, we haven't, probably a good thing, and any podcast not to talk too much about politics, but one of the things I think is a real challenge for politicians at the moment is getting good politicians, you know, getting good people to go into politics, because it's poorly paid. Certainly in this country, it's poorly paid relatively. I know it's more than the national income, but it's not well paid, and is also a world which exposes your entire life to public scrutiny, whether you like it or not, even the bits of it that aren't relevant. And therefore, for an awful lot of people, I think they're just not going to do it, and they're not interested in doing it. So you do end up with people doing it who are not necessarily in all instances the ideal ones to do it. I mean, there are plenty of good people in politics, but there's also plenty of people that frankly could be better. And I think solving some of the challenges that are there around, just in the UK, you look at health, you look at welfare, you look at infrastructure. These are things that are such politically driven things now for the public. So if you turn around and say, right, well, this is my party's agenda, we're going to turn around and completely reconfigure the health service or reconfigure the welfare system, they're political vote losers, almost guaranteed, because it means either people are going to be paying a ton more money in tax in order to fix it, or they're going to get a lot less service. Either one of those is not acceptable. And you can translate much of that into what goes on in the corporate world as well, where I think there are some quite difficult dynamics. But ultimately, prevaricating and procrastinating about it is not going to solve the problem. And so it will force, beyond my lifetime, I'm sure, but it will force behaviors that are different in terms of having to be more radical, having to be bolder. But I mean, maybe I'm just being...
But that's the trouble is that, what you're talking about there is short-termism in business. And this is where, in terms of leadership, we've got to be very careful that we always talk business, because ultimately, even, big businesses fail, but it doesn't generally affect the world. Yes, I get it. It affects the livelihoods of, and I'm not discounting this in terms of the damaging effect it has, but a big company fails, people go and find other jobs, and other company fills that abyss. But when you're talking about government systems, that's short-termism of, I need this tomorrow. Well, you can't solve the problems tomorrow. And therefore it's an accepting as a politician to make the right answer rather than the popular answer, because the popular answer is short term. The requirement is long term solutions, but you won't very easy to be dismantled. And I do agree with you. If we, on both left and right wing, if we completely dismiss any human being who is courageous enough, there's nothing better than a political discussion around a dinner party table. And that proves background, I suppose, which you can label me all you want. And I don't have a problem, but we're not having a dialogue. We're having a labeling. Going back to that use of language, we now just label, yeah, this, and that. Rather, the dialogue is how do we both roughly want the same ends, but the means by which we get there, left or right, is different. How do we put that together to a long-term solution? But in that, it is required. That's why you don't want to waste a good crisis. And what I mean is when you have a crisis, you have some fluidity where you can adjust faster. And so that's why I think adversity, there's the lovely Kintsugi, which is, finding beauty in broken things. When things break, you can reform them faster. So I had a friend of mine who was very senior in the civil service who had an online IT strategy. And she said it was going to cover 2 to 3 years, but she didn't believe it was actually going to work because she said the civil service just won't do this. I mean, it was enacted by the civil service, but within a month, I was chatting to her when the pandemic, she said, we'd set 2 to 3 years and I wasn't sure it was going to happen. The pandemic happened, and 2 weeks later, virtually everyone was on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And as we all know, it has accelerated the way we work by 10 years because of that crisis. And so I go back to almost everything I've said is it has evolved from the Gulf in terms of the speed, depth, and breadth with our own. Don't go away thinking I'm a damaged human being. Adversity, when things break, that's when human beings become human. Actually, we deal with stuff. The trouble is it starts over time, things start to coalesce and sort of become rigid. But actually, a crisis in all our lives, suddenly it actually gives freedom. So I'm going to tell a story. I'll probably end on that because I've been chatting far too much. When people go, this came from the Gulf, they're going, so I'm going to remove your memory. Okay? I'm going to give you amnesia. You will never remember who you are, whether you're married or not, what your career was, but you're not going to remove your intellect and your knowledge or your talent or anything else. And I'm going to strip you naked, which is a rather horrible thought, but I'm going to strip you naked and I'm going to dump you in Leicester Square. You will never, ever recover your past from here. What would happen? Well, probably, people laugh at you standing there and you'd feel embarrassed and you go, and you can't even remember your name, by the way. You don't even know your name. Okay? And eventually somebody will go, oh, mate, are you okay? And they'll give you a jacket or something to cover you up. And then they'd get the police involved. And let's say you're in the system for 3-6 months, social services, they try and find you. They will never find your background. So you have no background, but you have your body, your mind, everything. I reckon most of us, we're restricted by the systems in which we have created ourselves. So your marriage, let me make assumptions, you'll have fidelity in that. So I won't sleep with anyone else. So that's a restriction. If you had kids, you say kids restrict you. You're restricted by the mortgage you have, the pensions, all the stuff that we build in life then ends up being wrapping us up in restrictions. Whereas in 6 months' time, you probably go, I'll do what I want to do. I have complete freedom. Now, whilst we say, but what about responsibility and accountability? But those are restricted. And that's what the Gulf did for me. It transformed the way I think about life because you suddenly realize, even when they put a gun against your head, you still have a choice. And they stripped me naked. No one was going to see me die, whether I was going to cry like a baby, shit or piss myself or look them in the eye. But in a quarter of a second, I'm dead on the floor. But in that moment, for all the circumstance that led me to that point, you still have a choice to be yourself, because I didn't want to die disappointing myself, and no one was going to see me die. And I didn't want to die disappointing myself and be defined by the circumstances. And I chose to die as who I am. And that is transformation. And that's with life. The trouble is we build the lives around us where we are constrained by the very things we love and we build become restrictive, that we cannot escape the lives we've built, which means all the things we say, learn faster, do different things. And that's why I say the Gulf was a gift, because all the lessons I learned from the Air Force, all the stuff I've learned, I've been gifted a life where I can design my own life. And I appreciate most people don't get that gift, but that came from crisis, not from conformity.
Awesome. That's a great way to finish. And John, you've been really, really generous with your time. It's been, I knew it would be, fascinating conversation. You've brought to life a huge amount of really valuable points there. I think we've had a great conversation around some leadership challenges there too. So I'm enormously grateful, and thank you very, very much indeed.
Okay, so lovely to see you. Have a fantastic 2025.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, John. Without a doubt, that was one of the most powerful stories that I've yet had the privilege to hear on this podcast. And I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And you got a lot from the fantastic tips and thoughts that John Peters was able to put over in that time. If you did enjoy it, I'd be really grateful for some help. I would love you to like the podcast, provide some feedback, comment on it, share it widely on social media with all your friends, because I think there's some really great stuff in there that an awful lot of people could benefit from, and it deserves a much wider hearing than perhaps it will get without that stimulation from all of you. If you find it really valuable and you continue to find the stuff I provide really valuable, then go one step further for me and either click on the support the show link in your podcast platform, which will take you to my Patreon site, www.patreon.com/leadingforlife. And you can financially support the show. And that is entirely voluntary, but would really make a big difference to me being able to continue to do the work I do to pull all this together. And for the price of less than a couple of cups of coffee a month, you can make a massive difference to what I do. So I would hugely appreciate that. You'll find all the details there, and just take a look, see if that takes your fancy. And if it does, I would be very grateful. In the meantime, more to come soon. And I really, really look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.